Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Let us continue with our tafsir of Surah Al-Baqarah bihawlillahi wa quwwatih. And we are on ayah number 282. قال الله تعالى: يا أيها الذين آمنوا إذا تداينتم بدين إلى أجل مسمى فاكتبوا وليكتب بينكم كاتب بالعدل ولا يأبى كاتب أن يكتب كما علمه الله فليكتب وليملل الذي عليه الحق وليتق الله ربه ولا يبخس منه شيئا فإن كان الذي عليه الحق سفيها أو ضعيفا أو لا يستطيع أن يمل هو فليملل وليه بالعدل واستشهدوا شهيدين من رجالكم فإن لم يكونا رجلين فرجل وامرأتان ممن ترضون من الشهداء أن تضل إحداهما فتذكر إحداهما الأخرى ولا يأبى الشهداء إذا ما دعوا ولا تسأموا أن تكتبوه صغيرا أو كبيرا إلى أجله ذلكم أقسط عند الله وأقوم للشهادة وأدنى ألا ترتابوا إلا أن تكون تجارة حاضرة تديرونها بينكم فليس عليكم جناح ألا تكتبوها وأشهدوا إذا تبايعتم ولا يضار كاتب ولا شهيد وإن تفعلوا فإنه فسوق بكم واتقوا الله ويعلمكم الله والله بكل شيء عليم. Here it is, the giant of the Quran, the longest ayah, which covers one whole page of the Medina Mus'haf. And what's interesting is that it is not even about pure Tawheed, which is what you may expect in the Quran. This ayah, the longest one, is about business. And the reason why Allah Jalla wa Ala speaks about this debt is because you'll notice previously he was speaking much about riba and how destructive it is and its evils, and how it is one of only two places in the Sharia in which Allah Jalla wa Ala declares war on the perpetrator. So after speaking about riba, Allah Jalla wa Ala speaks about the proper way to give out a loan, which is without interest, and He gives us some rules and regulations about debts. So let's take some vocabulary. We have the famous call, O you who believe. So it means that whatever is going to follow will test your iman. If you have true iman, you will follow. If you do not have any true iman, or your iman is lacking, then you will not follow. He says, إِذَا تَدَايَنْتُمْ. This is from the word dain, which means debt. So the wazn tafa'ala is about two people doing things to each other. So when you put each other in debt, meaning one borrows from the other and the other borrows from the other, so they're borrowing from each other and they're putting each other in debt. Or maybe you purchase something and you have to pay them later. Okay, that's a debt on you. So it's like people putting each other in debt. Of course, that is perfectly permissible. You're allowed to borrow and lend. You're allowed to pay back later, and that will be a debt upon you. That's not a problem. The problem is riba, of course, as we discussed before. He says, إِلَى أَجَلٍ مُسَمَّى, up to an ajal, meaning a time period, musamma, named, from ism, meaning name. So musamma means that which is named, or that which is specified. So I'll purchase this from you and I'll pay you back after 1 week or after 1 month. It's a specified time period. Notice a linguistic point. He says, إِذَا تَدَايَنْتُمْ بِدَيْنٍ, when you contract a mutual debt, when you put each other in debt with a debt. So the word tadayana includes debt. It's what it's all about. You can see the root letters are the same thing. Therefore, the word bidain is unnecessary. However, it is there for emphasis. Similarly, we find in the Quran, Allah Jalla wa Ala says, وَلَا طَائِرٍ يَطِيرُ بِجَنَاحَيْهِ, and not a bird flying with its wings. So the words بِجَنَاحَيْهِ, with its wings, are unnecessary because, of course, a bird flies with its wings. But it's there for emphasis. Anyway, we are talking about a debt, and the essence of a debt is that somebody gives you something now, and in return you owe him something to be paid or given back at a later date. This is a debt. Normally, It would be that you purchase an item, you take it home and you pay later, or maybe you pay in installments. You can have the reverse of that, bay' salam, which we have spoken about in our fiqh presentations, which is when you pay the money now and you receive the item at a later date. So that item now, the merchandise, is the actual debt. So he says when you have this transaction where somebody has to pay you back at a later date, faktubu, from kataba yaktubu, probably the most famous verb, that it means to write down. So he's telling us to write this down so that there will be no disputes later on. Is this order form for obligation or recommendation? Most scholars say it is recommendation and not obligation. He says let a katib, meaning a writer or a scribe, write it down bil adl, with justice. So that means to say he's going to write down precisely what was agreed. He's not going to detract anything and not going to increase anything. So this is justice. So his own personal feelings and bias is not going to play a part in what he writes down. One might ask, but do you really need a scribe? Can you not just write it down yourself? Well, the answer is yes, of course you can. However, in those days, most people were illiterate. And he says that the scribe should not refuse. The verb used is aba, ya'ba, which means to refuse. He should not refuse to write it down. Kama allamahu Allah. Now this could have two interpretations. Kama could mean as, so he should not refuse to write down as Allah has taught him, meaning he will write down the way Allah has taught him to write down. After all, it is Allah alone who teaches us how to read and write and speak, and all the abilities that we have are taught to us by Allah Jalla wa Ala ultimately. The second interpretation, kama, could be ta'leel, justification. So that means that because Allah has taught him to write down, he should write down. And both meanings are correct. And then he says, let the one against whom is the haqq, meaning the right. This means the debtor, because upon him is to pay the debt. Allah is saying, let this person yumlil. The verb is amalla yumillu imlalan ala, which means to dictate ala to someone. Amalla can also mean to make something boring or tiresome, but in this context it means to dictate. So the debtor is going to dictate what debt he has, and he says وَلَا يَبْخَسْ مِنْهُ شَيْئًا. From bakhisa yabkhasu, to decrease, naqs. So Allah Jalla wa Ala is telling him that he has to have taqwa of Allah and not decrease anything. For example, if he owes £100 debt, he should not dictate that I owe £95 of debt. This would be dishonesty, and Allah Jalla wa Ala orders us to be honest in all our affairs. Being dishonest can save you money, but it will not save you from the fire. Then he says, if the debtor is safi, normally safi means foolish, but in this context it means one of poor understanding and does not know how to dictate the terms properly. So it could be, for example, a little child or someone who is mentally restricted. أو ضعيفا, meaning weak. So weak could refer to a young child or a very old person, because both of these types of ages are ages of weakness, both mentally and physically. He says, أو لا يستطيع أن يمل هو, or if he is not able to dictate. So this could be if he is mute, because some people are simply unable to speak, they are mute. Or, for example, he is unable to express himself properly. Maybe he has to speak a foreign language and he is unable to do so. Or it could be that he is simply absent. He says, فَلْيُمْلِلْ وَلِيُّهُ. The lam is lam al-amr, meaning let. His wali, meaning his guardian. Let his guardian dictate in place of that particular person, meaning the debtor. So this could be a person's father or grandfather or son, or someone who is in charge of his affairs. And again we find the order is to dictate bil adl, with justice, which was what we spoke about before. He says wastashhidu. The verb is istashhada yastashhidu istihshadan, which means to seek, because the letters ist before a verb can often mean to seek something. So it is to seek shahidaini, 2 witnesses, min rijalikum, from the men of yours. So this is 2 Muslim men. And this order is, according to the majority, a recommendation and not an obligation. He says, but if you cannot find 2 men, then 1 man and 2 women, mimman tardawna min ash-shuhada, from those whom you are pleased as witnesses, meaning these people who are going to witness the transaction and possibly even give testimony in court if it comes down to it, if there's a dispute, then these witnesses need to be from those people whom the community sees as trustworthy people. So it's all down to the customs and the community. These people do not have to be perfect Muslimin with no sins on their record. No, they simply have to be people whom the community trusts as witnesses. And the reason for the 2 women is given in the ayah, أَن تَضِلَّ إِحْدَاهُمَا, if one of them, تَضِلَّ normally means to be lost or to be misguided. In this particular context, it means to forget. She may forget some part of the facts. And he says, فَتُذَكِّرَ, from تَذْكِير, which means to remind, إِحْدَاهُمَا الْأُخْرَى, one of them will remind the other. Now it's interesting, this style of speech. He does not say if one forgets, then the other will remind her. He says one of them reminds the other. So this includes the fact that, let's say there are 2 women, A and B. A forgets certain portion of the facts, B reminds her. But also B might forget certain portions of the facts, and so A reminds her. In other words, they remind each other. And this is how the ayah stylized this concept. Otherwise, Allah Jalla wa Ala simply could have said, فَتُذَكِّرَهَا الْأُخْرَى, one of them reminds her. But rather he says, إِحْدَاهُمَا الْأُخْرَى, one of them reminds the other. So it's a 2-way traffic rather than a 1-way traffic. It's a subtle linguistic point. And then he says that the shuhada should not ya'ba, we spoke of this word, meaning to refuse. So the shuhada, the witnesses, should not refuse when they are du'u, from da'a yad'u, to call. So du'u meaning to be called, the passive sense. The ma after the idha is an extra word in terms of the grammatical structure, meaning the sentence would be absolutely fine without the word ma. However, it is there for emphasis. So this part of the ayah says that the witnesses should not refuse. Now there are 2 points to this. You have tahammul and you have ada. Tahammul, which means to carry something or to bear the burden of something, this means when you stand as a witness in a transaction. Ada, meaning to perform or discharge your duty, means when you testify in a court to what you saw. This ayah is saying that the witnesses should not refuse. This refers both to the tahammul and the ada. So you should not refuse if people call you to be a witness to a particular transaction. If you are a trustworthy person and people see you as trustworthy, then go ahead and accept this call and do not refuse. Because in refusing, it may be the case that rights are lost and evidence is lost. So we could say that the tahammul is fard kifaya. It needs to be done by somebody if the witnesses are called. Somebody must take the job, otherwise think about what's happening. Evidence is being lost. What about the ada? The ada, if you are called to testify in a court, then this is an obligation upon you. Because if you do not do so, then rights will be lost and you will be responsible for that. So this is now a fardu ayn upon you. So notice tahammul, fardu kifaya, and the ada is fardu ayn. And then he says, وَلَا تَسْأَمُوا. The verb sa'ima yas'amu sa'amatan means to become weary and tired. Do not become weary and tired. To write it down, meaning write the debt down. صغيرا أو كبيرا إلى أجله. Whether it is a small debt or a large debt, up to an appointed term, do not be tired and weary to write it down. Rather, you should write it all down. He says, ذَلِكُمْ, that is, أقسط عند الله. So أقسط meaning أعدل, more just with Allah, that you should write the debt down. وأقوم للشهادة meaning أحفظ, it preserves more. So when something is قائم, it means it's standing or upright. So it's preserved. This preserves the testimony, the shahada. Okay, how is that the case? When you record the agreements, that such and such a person owes such and such a person this much, and so on, all the details, and you have the signatures of the witnesses, and when the witnesses see their signatures, they'll be able to recall what they stood witness to. Because it's possible that the witnesses can forget some detail, but when they see it written down, it could jog their memory. So this is better and more ahfadh, more preserving for the testimony. And he says, وَأَدْنَى meaning closer, أَلَّا تَرْتَابُ, for you not to, irtaba, yartabu, from raib, meaning doubt. Because later on there could be doubts. What was the debt? Was it £100 or £110? What was it? We are in doubt. But when you have written it down, then the chances of being in doubt severely decrease. Whether the creditor doubts or the debtor or the witnesses, everyone can have doubts. This is why you write these things down. He says, illa, except, meaning he's giving an exception to the order to write down the debt. He says, illa an takuna, that it is a tijara, a trade, hadira, meaning present right now. That is to say, on the spot. So the merchandise is handed over and the money is handed over right here, right now, on the spot. So in a case like this, there is no debt. So he says, فَلَيْسَ عَلَيْكُمْ جُنَاحٌ أَلَّا تَكْتُبُوهَا. There is no sin upon you that you do not write it down. He says, حَاضِرَةً تُدِيرُونَهَا بَيْنَكُمْ. The verb is أَدَارَ يُدِيرُ إِدَارَةً. A mudir is a manager because he conducts the affairs of the organization. So تُدِيرُونَهَا meaning you are conducting this trade بَيْنَكُمْ amongst yourselves. However, he goes on to say, وَأَشْهِدُوا إِذَا تَبَايَعْتُمْ. When you conduct in mutual trade, أَشْهِدُوا, take witnesses. And most scholars are of the opinion that this order is for recommendation. Of course, nowadays, when you go to the shops and you purchase things, you do not have witnesses, but you have receipts. And this is good enough. If you want to return the item, what do you have to do? You have to show the receipt. And that is like a witness. And of course, receipts are so much more convenient and quicker than actual witnesses standing before every trade that you make. Then he says, وَلَا يُضَارَّ كَاتِبٌ وَلَا شَهِيدٌ. ضَارَّ يُضَارُّ from darar meaning harm. So ضَارَّ would mean to harm somebody else. Now this could be interpreted in two ways. Firstly, the katib and the shaheed should not harm others, meaning if the katib, the writer, distorts what is supposed to be written down, or the witness distorts his testimony, then they would be harming either the creditor or the debtor. The other way that this could be understood is that the katib and the shaheed should not be harmed. If the katib is called to write down or the witness is called to witness the transaction, and suppose they are busy and are unable to do so, so then the creditor or the debtor abuses them or harms them in some way. So in other words, there should be no harm in whichever direction you're going. He says, وَإِن تَفْعَلُوا, and if you do it, meaning if you harm, again, whichever direction, as we said, it's a two-way traffic, فَإِنَّهُ, then it is فُسُوق. Fusuq means to come out, and in this context means to come out or to leave the obedience of Allah. So we may translate it to disobedience or wickedness. Then he says, وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ, that's clear, وَيُعَلِّمُكُمُ اللَّهُ, and Allah teaches you, and Allah is alim of everything, He knows all things. When he says Allah teaches you, then we may say that knowledge which Allah teaches us is of two types. The first type is kasbi, from kasb, meaning to earn. This is the knowledge you earn by working hard and studying. This knowledge that comes your way by working hard is also from Allah, because Allah teaches you ultimately. So the credit ultimately belongs to Him. It does not belong to the books you're reading or the teacher who is teaching you. And the second type of knowledge is what they called wahabi or ladunni. So wahabi from the verb wahaba yahibu, which means to give a gift, and ladunni from the word ladun, meaning from, as in the statement of Allah about Khadir, وَعَلَّمْنَاهُ مِنْ لَدُنَّا عِلْمًا. We taught him from ourselves knowledge. This type of knowledge is a knowledge which comes naturally without necessarily having to study using books and lectures. This type of knowledge comes to people of taqwa who are righteous, and Allah Jalla wa Ala naturally opens up the doors of understanding and knowledge. Anyway, let's reflect on this ayah and see what we might pick up. We pick up from this ayah that the Quran is not just about matters of ibadah and tawheed, rather it gives us guidance on all affairs of life, including business. And especially in Surah Al-Baqarah, you would have noticed that we spoke about marriage and divorce, we spoke about Hajj and the Siyam, and we spoke about Qisas, and all these different matters. So Islam is a holistic way of life. We learn that it is absolutely permissible to contract a debt. What is haram is the riba, not the debt per se. Now, sometimes you could have these transactions where the seller says you can purchase this item for £100 now in cash, or you could pay in installments, but the total will come to £150. Is this permissible? According to this ayah, yes, it's permissible because it's a debt and you're allowed to contract a debt. This is not riba, because we're not saying that if you are unable to pay the installments in due time, then we will increase the price that you have to pay. That would be riba. But just telling somebody to pay in installments is not riba, even though the total price comes to more than the cash if it were paid on the spot, but that does not harm the transaction, because it's in the interest of the vendor to take the cash in hand, and it's in the interest of the purchaser to pay in installments. This is why oftentimes the installments total to more than if you were to pay cash in hand, and that is not a problem. It is not riba. And we learn that a debt to be paid at a known date is permissible. And from this we can take that the bay' salam, or what they call the bay' salaf, same thing, is permissible. Indeed, this is the reason why this ayah came down, is to make permissible the bay' salam. From this ayah we take notice the importance of justice. So when the writer writes down the contract, he does it with justice. He does not let his personal feelings influence what he's writing down. We notice that the one who is the debtor, he's going to dictate what is to be written down, and that he must also speak with justice and not harm anyone. We see that their sharia is meticulous in ensuring no one is harmed or wronged, and ensuring that even with trade transactions, brotherhood remains. We notice also the order given to write down the details of the trade. We may say that if in writing down the trade, this will ensure people's rights, and without writing it down, people's rights will be lost, then the claim can be made that it is an obligation to write down. Same thing with the witnessing. If without the witnessing, rights will be lost, then we have to say it is an obligation, because restoring the rights is an obligation, and whatever you need to do to fulfill an obligation is itself an obligation. However, on the other hand, if such things are not needed, then we can say it is a recommendation and not an obligation, and this appears to be a nice balanced view. What is apparent from this ayah is that the writer is a third party, neither the creditor nor the debtor. However, we ask the question, what if the creditor or the debtor were to write the transaction down? Would that be permissible? We can say yes, that would be permissible. However, we do not take the permissibility from this ayah. We take the permissibility from other general evidences. For example, in Surah An-Nisa, which says that you must stand as witnesses bearing justice, even if it be against your own self. We find in the event that the debtor is unable to dictate the terms, either through safa or da'af or adam al-istita'a, these 3 reasons given, then another person who acts on the debtor's behalf may do the dictating. But of course, justice must be observed. We also find the rule of witnesses. The discussion of this really is for the fiqh sessions, but in this particular ayah, Allah allows 2 men or 2 women and 1 man. But the condition is that these people must be people who are deemed to be trustworthy as witnesses in the society. So when it comes to matters of tahammul, which is to actually witness a particular transaction, then we are of course only going to choose righteous people. However, when it comes to ada, which is to testify in a court, then a person does not have to be righteous. He simply has to be a person who is seen to be trustworthy in his testimony. He could be somebody who smokes and who shaves the beard off, or maybe somebody who gambles. And yet in his testimony he is trustworthy and accurate. We also take that the woman is weaker in her testimony than the man, and is more likely to forget certain facts than the man. And this is why 2 women are in place of 1 man. And this is just one evidence amongst many which teaches us that this deen of al-Islam is not necessarily a deen of equality, although it is a deen of justice. And in this there is no insult to women. This is simply an observation of reality. It is simply reality that men are stronger than women in most scenarios, whether it be physically, emotionally, mentally. They simply are the stronger gender. And this is how Allah Jalla wa Ala has designed it. Simple as that. There is no insult in this whatsoever. But people just have a chip on their shoulder and they get paranoid extremely easily. We also take from the ayah that you must not tire out and be weary in your duty. So we're talking about the duty to write down the transaction. Do not let your laziness get the better of you, and do not cut any corners. From the words ila ajalihi, we find that if the debt is to a known term, then you write down what that term is, meaning the debt is to be paid off at such and such a date. It needs to be written down. And we find that Allah Jalla wa Ala gives us 3 benefits. Number 1, this is more just with Allah. Number 2, this is more effective for the witnesses, as we mentioned before. And number 3, there's a higher chance that you will not be in any doubt when you have written down the details. And we spoke about this before. We also learn that if the trade is on the spot, then you do not have to write down the details of the trade because there is no debt involved. However, even in this type of trade, Allah tells us to take witnesses. And like we said, this is a recommendation. The Prophet himself carried out much trade without any witnesses. We also learn that the scribe, the katib, or the witness, the shaheed, should not harm others, and they should not be harmed in aught, because harming, generally speaking, is haram. We learn from this ayah the recurring theme of the obligation of taqwa of Allah Jalla wa Ala, and we learn from this ayah that it is Allah who teaches us all what we know, and that we are born with ignorance, not with knowledge. And we also pick up the name of Allah, Alim, with its respective description. Let's just end this session off with a trivia. There are only 2 ayat in the Quran which contain all the letters of the alphabet, and ironically this ayah, being the longest ayah, does not contain all the letters of the Arabic alphabet. Rather, the 2 ayat which do contain all the alphabets are not the longest ayat. The first one is ayah number 154 of Surah Al-Imran, ثُمَّ أَنزَلَ عَلَيْكُم مِّن بَعْدِ الْغَمِّ أَمَنًا, up till the end of the ayah. And the second one is in Surah Al-Fath, the last ayah, 29, مُحَمَّدٌ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا مَعَهُ أَشِدَّاءُ عَلَى الْكُفَّارِ, up till the end. هذا والله أعلم.